This is Heart Rhythm TV. I'm Roderick Tung. Today we have a very special guest panel and a really exciting roundtable discussion on social media, science, and medicine. And with me today I have Janet Hahn from the West LA UCLA group. Janet, welcome.
Thanks.
We have Jared Bunch, Editor-in-Chief of Heart Rhythm Case Reports, University of Utah. Jared, welcome.
Thank you.
And we've got Ben Steinberg, University of Utah as well, formerly at the Brigham. And Ben is the first author of a very provocative, declarative paper that just came out this month in Circulation AE, stated simply, social media influence does not reflect scholarly or clinical activity in real life. Ben, welcome.
Thank you so much for having us.
Maybe you can start off by telling us what the impetus was and the motivation of doing this paper and collaborating with many great physician researchers.
Yeah, thank you so much again for having us. And as you noted, this was a collaboration between some good friends and colleagues and mentors of mine. Fortunately, we're very supportive. You know, the primary impetus of this was really the acknowledgement of how much social media is now playing a role in our field, particularly electrophysiology, which I think is actually relatively unique. It's growing across medicine and science, but I think is particularly unique in electrophysiology. And the question of how do you study that? So this was our initial look at some of what we perceived would be the challenges of studying that from a research or education standpoint in terms of identifying users, who those users are, how they're using Twitter. And to be frank, we couldn't and haven't yet gotten to one of the major challenges of how do you assess the contents of their use of Twitter. And so this particular analysis came out of this first step of how do you identify who these users are on Twitter and characterize them, and how can we approach that in perhaps a way that hadn't yet been done and might be unique to electrophysiology, but might help serve as possibly a microcosm for other specialties in medicine, at least.
So tell us a little bit about what your hypothesis was. Did you think there would be a correlation? Did you think there wouldn't be? And then tell us a little bit your methods, because I think for our audience, not everyone knows what an H index is, and not everyone knows what a K index, the Kardashian index, is.
Yeah, so, our first hypothesis was, we hope we can identify, can we identify electrophysiologists on Twitter? Can we describe them in some sort of scientific way? And, sort of hypothesize that there might not necessarily, based on our anecdotal experience, be a relationship between social media profile or influence, or however you want to describe it, and what they do clinically or academically. And again, try to, to the best we can, avoid necessarily judgments or subjective conclusions, but just to present the data. And so the way we approached this was first, what data sources were we going to use? And the first was obviously Twitter, to identify the users to the extent we could by their name, by their affiliation, and then to use other data sources. So the ABIM website for board certification, the National Provider Index for provider identification, and Medicare billing data for clinical volume. And then, as you highlighted, the H index, which is an academic measure. In fact, in some institutions can be used in promotion and retention assessments of academic productivity, and takes into account authors' publications, the impact of their publications, their citations of their publications into an overall index. And it's one of a few that actually I believe are in general proprietary, the calculations, not entirely unlike the impact factor of journals, but for researchers. And those data are actually relatively publicly available for people that have access through their institution to that data set. The other term you brought up was this K index, or the Kardashian index, which was popularized actually several years ago in the science, I believe the biogenetics realm, where an author, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but attempted to adjust Twitter users, followers, or their influence on media by their Google publication or Google citation, Google Scholar profile. And the index was meant, again, somewhat, I would guess, a little tongue-in-cheek, but meant to provide a reflection of the relationship or the proportion of social media influence that was observed versus that what might be expected based on the publication record, understanding that there are limitations to how you calculate the expected and the methods and understanding what that means. And so in general, it was thought that a higher Kardashian index implies that the social media influence would perhaps appear to be out of proportion to the influence of the person based on some other criteria. In the derivation, it was Google citations.
And Ben, I think you're putting it lightly, because I looked up Kardashian index on Wikipedia, and it defines people with, or scientists with K-index over 5 as having, in quotes, overblown scientific fame. And those at lower are those scientists that are more deserving of acknowledgement. So I think it's fascinating. And again, to reiterate, the H-index is something that is readily available if you get on Google Scholar. And essentially it's looking at the number of publications that you've had, and it's the exact intersection with the number of times it's been cited. So if you've had 3 papers that have been cited 3 times, then that's 3. And and vice versa. So to give people a sense of this, like the Marchlinskys and the Stevensons of the world, they're all sitting around 105 to 110. But that's kind of the scale for it. So what did you find, Ben and Jared? And then we'll kind of break out and go into a larger discussion of where we are with social media and science.
Yeah, so thanks again, and I'll kind of highlight what I think are the top line conclusions, and certainly I'm happy for Jared to chime in. I think the top lines are, one, we actually could identify, I think, roughly 10% of U.S. electrophysiology attendings. Again, we focused on attendings on Twitter, and I think that's one big message, that's a pretty significant proportion. I would venture to say it's higher than many other subspecialties. Number 2, a significant, among these users, they're pretty academically productive, an average of 30 papers or more on each index, up near 10. Not everybody can be Prstowski and Marchlinsky, but I would venture to say, again, compared to the general EP community, compared to other subspecialties, relatively productive academically. And then from a clinical standpoint, relatively productive clinically, although I will highlight one of the limitations is that, again, this is based on CMS or Medicare volume from a clinical standpoint. And so even, my co-author, Mintu Tarakia, has no volume from a standpoint of Medicare clinically because he's a VA operator. And so there are obviously limitations to this analysis. And then the last conclusion, which obviously I think gets a lot of the attention, but I think is tertiary, is that there's obviously outliers. There are people on Twitter who have a very large following and a very big voice and a very big platform, for better and worse, depending on how you look at it, who, whose clinical volume or academic productivity, at least by the measures we looked at, was not necessarily similarly outlying, if you will. And so I'll stop there. I'm certainly interested for Jared's, what Jared sees as
But would you say the bottom line is there isn't the best correlation between the social media influence and academic and clinical activities, and therefore the people that are being seen as experts with a lot of influence may not be, I don't want to say the word deserving, but not in the categories that are traditionally seen when we judge science?
Well, I think another way to look at it is whether or not these people, quote unquote outliers, are experts so much as they're clearly being heard by the most. And maybe that's well deserved because they have unique insights or opinions based on their interpretation of what's going on that's very valuable. But on the other hand, shouldn't necessarily be interpreted to mean that they have a scientific or clinical experience that is concordant with the social media following.
Dr. Bunch, what do you think is the take-home message of this paper?
Well, I agree with Ben, but I think there's something that we have to consider that's broader, and I think we have to do it more so over the newer generations of trainees. And that is, we always consider somebody a threat based upon clinical expertise or skill or leadership or research. And as you and I know, and everybody on this panel knows, that there's different skills. The skill to do research is different from the skill to be able to write. It's different from the skill to be able to lead physicians. It's different from the skill to be able to care for patients. Social media is a unique skill. It's the ability to engage a broad range of opinions and personalities in a small amount, in small bites. It's a dedication towards it. It's an interest in it. It's a unique medical skill. And I think there's a value to that. And I think we see that. We see unique people that take time out of their day to do it very well. But I also, at the same time, this paper does raise the need for us to be more transparent, particularly when we're giving medical advice, when we're trying to drive opinion that may impact the society. We all know that if I do a drug trial and Pfizer has given me hundreds of thousands of dollars, I need to disclose that. But we don't also impose the same restrictions to somebody that does not do atrial fibrillation ablation, that has a strong opinion about atrial fibrillation ablation, that maybe it should be done or shouldn't. And I think that's okay to say, this is my disclosure, and gauge my opinion in that. But I think what this does highlight is the ability to engage in social media is a unique skill. And I think EP is a wonderful specialty to show that, because we're technology oriented as a group, but I think we do see that in this paper.
Janet, you're one of the trailblazers on Twitter, and particularly for women in cardiology as well, and you're very facile with it. Is this a separate skill set? And why did you join social media?
That's a good question. So I joined probably about the same time as Ben. I think I've been on there for about a decade now.
You were a year after Ben. I've got the exact numbers as Ben started in 2009. You started in 2010. Jared started in 2013. And I started in 2016. I was a late adopter.
You're the late bloomer. So yeah, I've been on for a while, and it took me a long time. Like, I actually joined, and then I really was not active for about 5 years or more, actually, until really I met up with Jay Schloss and Mandrola at HRS. And you know, I think for me, it was a way to communicate science more than anything else. And that's really how I sort of, if you want to talk about building your brand or whatever people say these days, for me, it was to sort of communicate science, but also as to build sort of an educational platform, because I really wanted to steer away from the idea that Twitter is only about sort of selfies and fluff a little bit. And I wanted to use it as a way of communicating. So that's really why. Is it a way, is it a skill set? Probably. I think you have to be able to be very concise if you're going to try to be a science communicator on social media, and you have to be precise, right? So concise and precise, meaning you have to fact check, fact check, fact check. So for me, using it was all about science, all about communication, all about being factual.
And I think it was fun for us when we were doing JCE to really figure out how to be concise and deliver the message for the journal. Jared, as one of the editors of the Heart Rhythm Society family, as the Heart Rhythm editor of case reports, do you think that this has helped submissions and the dissemination of that knowledge, or do you think it actually could detract, because now you can get 5,000 likes on a tweet and you don't even need to publish it in a peer-reviewed journal?
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think it facilitates sharing of knowledge when done. And I like when it's done within the context of a journal or a society, or amongst some people that are very skilled in the area, because there's a dark side of Twitter, and that's appealing to the mob mentality and small segments of information. And we know that from our leadership currently, small segments of in our country of information can be profoundly divisive and gain momentum. And so I think it's helpful. It helps get people's voice out there quicker. I think what Janet said is exactly true, that you don't want to say anything inflammatory or false, because it's saved indefinitely. Even if you remove it, somebody has it. But because of that, and you know, Heart Rhythm Case Reports, we engaged on social media immediately, and we have a very large following of people that share and talk about these things, and talk about what we did poorly or good as editors, and accepting it. And I think all that's healthy for the journal. And you should also recognize that journals see value in that, because that the traditional scoring of journal that's based on citations alone, whether or not you include self-citation, doesn't truly impact or truly measure impact as we see it today, where now journals will use ultrametrics that say how often was it shared on Facebook, Twitter, and seeing that these represent scope of message. And that's valuable to a journal because they sell pages, they sell advertisements and things based on impact.
And Ben, you have been relatively not as active as perhaps Janet and Jared and myself on Twitter, but you joined in 2009. Why did you join Twitter, and what do you see as the strengths of Twitter?
Yeah, so I think initially I was curious to see what it was about. I was a resident and had heard that it was a way of getting real-time information about what was happening locally. I think eventually, as I went through training, I realized the value from a scientific standpoint, but then also realized, hopefully very quickly, as Jared highlighted, the pitfalls. And I have probably overcompensated for that on my lack of activity, which is to say that I tend to be try to be extremely thoughtful about what's on there, and sometimes will draft a tweet that sits in my drafts for days before putting it on there, just out of fear of what's in there. And so my personal rule, honestly, is unless I'm comfortable with all of my patients, all of my colleagues, all of my fellows, all of my family members, all of my kids reading whatever I've put, I won't put it out there. And so I think that's what you see in my kind of relatively low activity. I think the other thing is I think there's a number of different reasons to share things. And so either you have a thought or you're trying to further some idea or something like that. And whatever the reason is, I try to think about what the reason is I'm sharing what I'm sharing for that reason. I will also say that I maintain more than one account in terms of who I follow, what I follow, and how I can be identified. Again, for that reason, I think unfortunately we've seen a number of examples, even in our field, of people being judged, whether fairly or unfairly, for things that were shared that even are unrelated to their professional lives.
So beware of Ben Steinberg's burner accounts, basically. He's got multiple aliases. And
it's mostly for listening than for communicating.
Well, I'll tell you, I've loved social media. I was the latest adopter here. I started in 2016, and I was a little bit of a hater initially because I felt very similar to what you're saying, is that we shouldn't, confuse activity with achievement. But then you start realizing that the world has changed. Media is so pervasive and people are looking for bite-sized information. I'm not sure that's good, but it is. And being able to share something in our EP lab that you probably wouldn't ordinarily publish, just an electrogram, is quite fun and beautiful. And it gets some impact and impressions, and maybe someone makes a comment, but that engagement is something that makes EP so special. And I think that's probably why you're seeing so many EPs on. I don't see like a hashtag EP peeps for interventional and heart failure. I don't think they have a heart failure peeps. Do they, Janet? Or do the other subspecialties have it?
I mean, they have their own, hashtags, of course, that they discuss, like imaging and, the radial burst and that kind of stuff.
Right, exactly. They have theirs as well. But I think EP lends itself, because we're such a visual field based on details, where an electrogram can get a lot of buzz and a lot of influence. Just showing a WPW where you burn, it's like, oh, that's cool. We had something like that. And, oh, yeah, is that A or is that V? And I think that's the fun part about EP, and that's kind of why I loved it. And then to be able to obviously highlight some of your upcoming presentations and then increase engagement. But I have a lot of concerns about our attention to details, because the scientific process is that of tremendous rigor, tremendous devotion, and in a way we almost owe it to the authors to read the paper. And I've had a lot of comments to say, well, what did you find, or what did you do there? And it's like, well, the link is already there. You can read it, but then people are still resistant to even opening the link because they just want the answers immediately. And that's one thing that concerns me, to make sure we don't go so far the other way where people are resistant to actually going through the scientific process and reading the methods themselves. What do you guys think about that?
I think that's a generational change, Rod. We can see that in the journal, where when you take people by decades and you look at what's important in a research manuscript, that's evolving. And even as we switch from Gen X to millennials and things, it went from reading the methodology as the upfront part of the manuscript to the introduction and conclusion. And then it switched to perhaps the abstracts, but more interest in the editorial. There's a strong reason why the editorial gets more links than the manuscript itself. People just want it summarized. I think there's some significant problems with that because we lose our own ability to understand studies for their strengths and their limitations. And we have to do that. We have to remain suspicious. We have to remain interested in learning. We have to question no matter whoever it is, even if their H index is 110. We owe it to ourselves and our patients to question and try to learn from it. And even if we question and we find that they're completely right, we've learned. But I think that's foundational in our educational process, that as leaders in this field, which you all are, that we help our fellows and our residents and our interns see the value of stepping back and analyzing the manuscript for its complete worth.
And that's where I think it's clearly a spectrum, right? We could credit Val Fuster with Jack and creating the central illustration. And now you've got to create a separate figure for your paper to have a central illustration which is summarizing the entire thing so nobody has to read it, essentially. I think the intention was to make it easier to digest, but now it's to almost supplant the paper itself. And I think that that's obviously why everything in life is a spectrum. And when we take it to the nth degree and take it too far, the pendulum has to swing back a certain way as well.
Yeah. So I was going to say, Rod, you saw that sort of evolution into the visual abstract. I think that's what you're kind of referring to, is the visual abstract of this sort of, in the business, they call it sort of bite-sized chunks of information.
And that's what we were trying to do with JCE, right, Janet, right? Is getting them bite-sized visuals.
Bite-sized. Yeah, but
and we know tweets are terrible without visuals. They don't do well without an image.
Yeah, you
Correct.
have to have, people are visual creatures, and I think you can't forget that, right? But the thing is, you have to remember in all of this talk about social media is not the end all be all. It's a tool. It's just like anything else. It's a tool to lead you to the journal article so that, like Jared said, you can read it for yourself. You should never use this as a tool, as an end all be all for facts, right? You should always look at the tweet, read it, and then go to the fact source yourself and analyze it yourself. And that's what I hope we can, encourage people to do that are sort of entering this field of social media.
I love that, and I think that could be a perfect summary for this nice roundtable, because it's meant to guide, it's meant to direct traffic, and it's not meant to supplant science. And that's my concern, is that I don't want us to get to a place where it's now taking over actually reading journals. And if you think about it, one of the reasons I joined was to say, well, I don't leaf through New England Journal, Lancet, and Circulation in the office on a leisurely day anymore, but I do subscribe to all of them, and I read through them when I get there. But is this something that you think is helpful as a journal tracker? What's your recommendation, final thoughts for the young new generation that's coming through that want to be physician scientists? Ben, we'll start with Ben, then go to Jared, and then Janet, about how best to use Twitter. What's the best use of this?
So thanks, and again, thanks. This is a great panel. I think the first step is feel it out for yourself. And we haven't mentioned yet, there are a few nice papers out there. I think one in Jack Case Reports that talks about kind of early on starting, particularly for trainees. But the first thing I was to feel it out for yourself and see what you're comfortable seeing. And then try to understand sources of information. And this is going to be true in all facets of life for trainees and new people starting out, particularly in our day and age, which is, if it's not Twitter or Facebook, or it's going to be something else, where the onus is on you, particularly as a physician or a scientist, to understand sources of information and grade evidence and how you interpret it. And whether that means, going to the link or understanding who the author of the tweet is or what have you. I think that's kind of my biggest piece of advice, is find out what you're comfortable with, what you're interested in, and then get used to and become skillful as much as possible in trying to understand sources of information and quality.
Jared, your sage advice to the young doctors in training that are growing up in this era?
Yeah, I would, one, use it. I wouldn't let it compromise your family, what you love, your exercise, your things that you spending time outside, but do it and engage in a really friendly and outgoing community. I would caution that when you read tweets, realize they're one opinion. We see these tweetorials on statistics where they'll find a single point of controversy and try to negate a paper, and just realize that's one opinion. And if another statistician was there, they could say the exact opposite. And so take it for what it's worth and go towards the paper if you want to find out yourself. And third, I think there's value in all of these things as tools. They're not exclusive, they're synergistic. And then finally, be careful what you post and make sure it doesn't have anything identified on it. And I know we use Twitter a lot to show interesting cases, but be very careful. We've even had papers in the Heart Rhythm Case Report Journal that the patient has come back a year later and said, I can identify that based on the author set and something on the image. So be careful with that and what you post, and make sure it's okay that everybody can see it.
Great advice, Jared. Janet, final thoughts for some of the new generation coming in?
So I would echo both what Ben and Jared have said, definitely. I think, if I could tell the newer set one thing, it would be sort of, dip your toe in. Don't jump in with both feet immediately. Again, I took years before I actually put out my first tweet. And like Ben, I would draft it and wait until I was super comfortable. So I would say watch, learn from the people that have done it and done it well and have not gotten into trouble, right? And just sort of learn from the experience and then dive in, right? It is can be a really good educational experience. And again, if you are careful and you use it for education, again, meaning that use it as a tool and not as the end all be all, I think you'll do fine.
I think those are great pieces of advice. I have come up with an analogy that I think social media is like alcohol. And alcohol itself doesn't have any inherent goodness or badness related to it. It could actually be used to kill a virus and disinfect, but it can also be used as social lubricant to create bonds. But it can also be used to be very destructive and can cause drunk driving, etc. It's how you use it and how you implement it that is where its value is. And there's obviously misuse and there's great use for it. So I think I'm just hoping that we all understand the limitations and the strengths of it. But I particularly love it. It's been fantastic, and I really would argue that there's never a moment that I log into Twitter that I don't learn something new from EP peeps and throughout all of cardiology. So thank you very much to the distinguished panel. Ben, congratulations. Jared, congratulations on the paper. Janet, thanks for joining us, and I hope this is useful for all of Heart Rhythm TV to have this really candid discussion on social media, science, and medicine.